Acts chapter 21, verses 26 to 40. A riot in the temple. We left Paul in the last section where he was told by James to pay for these four men's having a vow and so forth. And so now this is the result of what happens. In verse 26, it begins. Tote o Pavlos paralavon tous andros ti ecumeni imera synaptis. Then Paul, having taken the men the next day with them, so apparently Paul and some others went with the four men, agonisthis, having been purified, shaving the head, and then burning the hair. It mentions that a vow in Acts 18:18 video. You can look it up and have way more information on the vowing. And so, having been purified, isii is to eron, the angelon tin ek plirosin ton imeron to agonismu. He entered into the temple, declaring the fulfillment of the days of the purification. Now, exactly how they did this, who they're talking to, it doesn't say. I don't know what it would be, but some act by Paul shows that the fulfillment had taken place. Eos ou prosinekthi hyper enos ekastu avton e prosphora, until of which the offering was offered for each one of them. So probably the offering, they give money and then they burn the hair. In verse 27, os the emelen e epta emere sintelisthe, and when the 7 days were about to be completed, so apparently this vow fulfillment goes over a period of time of 7 days. E apo tis asias Iudei, the Jews from Asia, and Asia generally means Ephesus here in Acts, Theosamani avton in Toiro, having seen him in the temple. Now we remember when he was in Ephesus, had all sorts of problems with the people there. I think it was Demetrius, the silversmith, making idols of Artemis and causing a commotion. So now apparently somebody that had seen this knows who Paul is, and so he is going to tell the officials in Jerusalem that he's now here in Jerusalem and in the temple. Theosamani avton into Iro, having seen him in the temple. Sinen keon panta ton oklon. It caused a tumult with all the multitude. Ke epivalon tas hieros ep avtun, and put hands upon him. So these men from Ephesus grabbed a hold of him, and it says, Krazontes, crying out, Andres, Israelite, men, Israelites, voithite, help! Utos estino anthropos, o katat tu leu, ke tu nomu, ke tu topu tutu, patas pataku didaskon. This is the man teaching all everywhere against the people and the law and this place. He's against everything, blaming him. Etithe ke elinas isinaken is to iron. Since still indeed even Greeks he brought into the temple that were non-Jews, which was not allowed. So these men are saying that they're bringing him in, although it wasn't true. And it says here, ke kek kino ke ton agion topon tuton, and has made this holy place unclean. Now, that was a bad thing to happen because these people were spending a lot of money for these animals, and now everything is unclean. They may have no longer had a valid sacrifice, money being spent for nothing. Isengar eorakotes trophimon ton ephesion enti poli synapto, for they were, having seen Trophimus the Ephesian, with him in the city. On enomizon otiis toiron isigagen o Pavlos, whom they thought that Paul had brought into the temple. Now the tumult that came about that was mentioned there a few verses back, number 4797, it's also to confound. In Genesis 11:9 it says, on account of this the name of it was called confusion, because there the Lord confounded the lips of all the earth. That was been at the Tower of Babel. Nahum 2:4 says, in the ways the chariots shall be in a tumult. So the tumult of all these chariots rushing for war. In Acts 19:32, for the assembly was in tumult, and most did not know for what reason they had come together, and that was with Demetrius, this silversmith in Ephesus. And this Trophimus was a person that Paul had picked up when he was in Ephesus. He was not a Jew, of course, as it says here, and he traveled with Paul right before he got back here to Jerusalem, through all these islands that we went through in the last couple of sections in Acts 20. And then later, 2 Timothy 4, Paul mentions leaving him sick in Miletus. In verse 30, Akinethi, and was shaken. Kinetics comes from that motion. And was shaken, te epoli soli, the entire city indeed. So Jerusalem is all in uproar. Ke ageneto syndromi tu leu, and there became a stampede of people. And these stampedes of people, a lot of people can get trampled to death. That has happened on Mount Meron, where certain Hasidic Jews go up because of a certain rabbi doing something there, and they had a stampede of people, and many were killed. I don't remember how many, a couple of years ago, maybe 100, by being trampled upon. So here we have the stampede of these large amount of people that are wanting to get rid of Paul. Poor Paul. Ke epilavomeni tu Pavlu, and having taken hold of Paul, ilkon avton exo tu Ieru. They drew him outside of the temple. Now they knew who Paul was, that he was sent by the Jewish leaders to capture the Christians and even go up into Damascus and bring them back, and then how Paul became one of these Christians. And so the people knew who he was. And so the ones that didn't like what was going on wanted to get rid of Paul, whatever way they can. So here it says, Ke eptheos eklistheson e theore, and immediately they locked the doors of the temple. Zitunton they avton apokatine, and having sought to kill him, anevi phasis to heliarcho tis spiris oti oli synchechite Jerusalem. A report ascended to the commander. Heliarch is a man that's over 1,000 troops. That's what it means as far as the Greek word, but basically it's talking about a Roman tribune here, and who was a commander of the cohort. And the cohort in Jerusalem was part of a legion. I believe the name of the legion was Forensis, and this cohort was of 480 men. It was a 1/10 of a legion. There's 10 cohorts in a legion, so this cohort of 480 people. Now, it doesn't mean every one of them came, but he was the commander of these men, and so he hears about this. And then verse 32, os exavtis who immediately paralavon stratiotas, having taken soldiers, ke ekatontarchus, and centurions, cathedramen ep avtus, ran down upon them. So all of these Roman soldiers come flying down to find out what's going on with this tumult was far. Ide idontes ton heliarchon ke tus stratiotas, and the ones having beheld the commander and the soldiers, epav santo tiptontes ton pavlon, they ceased beating Paul. They seen the soldiers coming. Egisos they, and having approached, Heliarchos epilavato avtu, the commander took hold of him, grabbed him, and ke ekelevse dethine alisisi visi, and bid him to be bound with 2 chains. Ke epinthanato tis on to inquire about him whom he might be. Ke tis esti pepiikos, and what he is having done that caused this giant tumult. In verse 34, ali they alo ti evoon into oklo, and others to another were yelling in the multitude, mi dinamenos they genosne to asphalis thea ton thorivon, and not being able to know safely because of the tumult, ekelevson agisthe avton is tin paramvolin. He bid them to lead him into the camp. Now the camp was probably the Antonia fortress. And here we have a picture of what it might have looked like. The fortress, so all the Roman soldiers stayed, and it's attached to the temple right here. So all they had to do is come out, and they're right into the court of the temple. Ote the ageneto epi tus anavathmos sinevi vastazesthe avton hypo ton stratioton. And when he took place at the stairs, it happened that he was borne by the soldiers, viatin vian to oklu, because of the force of the crowd. Verse 36, ikoluthi gar to plethos to leu, for the multitude of the people followed, crying out, Are avton, take him away, get rid of him. So these soldiers now got Paul, lifting him up, carrying him back to the fortress. Melonte isagesth is tin paramvolin, and being about to be brought into the camp, Pavlos legi to heliarcho. Paul says to the commander, E existi me epin prose, is it allowed for me to speak to you? O the Ephi, and he said, Elinisti genoskes, you know Greek? And Paul, of course, knew Aramaic, knew the language of the people and the true Hebrew of the scriptures. In verse 38, Uk ara cei o Aegyptios, o pro tuton ton imeron, anastatosas. The commander says, well, are you not then the Egyptian who before these days, having overthrown ke exagagon is tin erimon tus tetrakiskilius andros ton sicarion, and leading out into the wilderness the 4,000 men of the Sicarii? The Sicarii were assassins, basically. They carried knives underneath their cloaks, and they would kill their enemies, whoever they thought would be beneficial for them. The wilderness possibly could have been where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by Masada. and they were tied in somewhat to Masada by Josephus in his book Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War. And the sword that they had was called a sika, and that's where they get the Sicarii, because they had these swords. And it continues then, Ipe they o Pavlos, and Paul said, Ego anthropos men, I am a man indeed, emi Iudeus Tarsefs, am a Jew of Tarsus, which was up in what's today's Turkey, tes Kilikias of Cilicia, ukasimu Polios politis, a citizen of not an unmarked city, important city to the Romans. Theome they su epitrepson me lalise pros ton leon. And I beseech you, commit it to my care to speak to the people. Verse 40, epitrepsantos they avtu, and he, the commander, having permitted, o Pavlos estos epi ton anavathmon, Paul having stood upon the stairs, katesise ti hiri toleo, he waved his hand to the people. Listen to what I have to say. Polis they sigis genomenes, prosephonise ti Ibraidi dialecto legon. And then with a great quietness having taken place, he called out in the Hebrew dialect, saying, and we'll go into what he had to say in the next section, but it's interesting, the Hebrew dialect, number 1258, a dialect, Esther 9:26, it says, on account of this they call these days Purim, because of the lots. For in their dialect they are called Purim, because of the words of this letter. Now, I'm not exactly sure, this is in the book of Esther, where the Jews were to be killed. They were spared by Esther pleading with the king of Persia. And so now the dialect, which dialect they're talking about, the Persian or the Hebrew, I'm not sure. But that mentions a dialect. It says in Acts 1:19, and it became known to all the ones dwelling in Jerusalem, so as to call that place in their own dialect, Akeldama, that is, place of blood, Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified, in their dialect. The dialect of the Jews at that time was Aramaic. It wasn't the Hebrew of the Bible, but it was a language that was sort of partially originally of the Hebrew and then mixed in with the language of the Mesopotamian area when they were taken to Babylon. It mentions in Acts 2:8, it says, and how hear we each in our own dialect in which we were born. That was at Pentecost. There were all these people from different places, saw these people with the Agios Pneuma, Holy Spirit on them, speaking in these languages, each of a person of a certain area, mentions all the names of them. So a dialect is of a name of a language of a certain people. In Acts 26:14, it says, and all of his fallen down unto the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew dialect. So here, Paul is saying that he heard Jesus speaking in the Hebrew dialect. That would have been Aramaic, the language of Jesus, not the true Hebrew. Although Jesus did read it because he read the Isaiah scroll, which would have been in pure Hebrew. Now, the same thing has happened in Greek. The Greek here is called Katharevis Greek. It's a sacred, holy type of the Greek of the Scriptures in the time of the Byzantines. Now, the Greek of today in Greece is called Dematiki, and it's a more modern Greek, and basically most people, as I was there in Greece, most people couldn't understand katharevas of Greek. And I ran across a man and his wife when I was working at the waterfront at a fish plant, and I heard him speaking, and I knew it was Greek. And I said, "You speak Greek?" And he was surprised that I knew, so I ended up showing around town in his car, and he was a Greek ship captain, and he was living in Salt Lake City, and he would get a phone call to go to the ship, fly to Greece, and get on the ship and take it to wherever the ship was going. So I invited him to come by my house and show them what I was doing with the Apostolic Bible. And he was amazed, and he said, "Well, that's katharevas of Greek," and he told his wife, who was American, that very few people understand this, mainly the clergy in Greece today. Also, it would be somewhat similar to the people today in the United States. We all speak English. But if you open a book of Shakespeare, you don't understand hardly anything he's saying. It's changed quite a bit to the modern English, and English is even changing every day. Words are being added. So the language of Jesus was Aramaic. It's used, I think, in about 7 places in the New Testament. One word was Abba, Abba Father, Mark 14:36. And then Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, in Mark 15:34. Talitha Kumi, a young woman, arise, in Mark 5:41. Ephaphra, that's be opened, to a man whose tongue was tied and couldn't talk, Mark 8:34. And then Rabboni, which was used by Mary at the tomb when she saw Jesus, knew who he was. And then earlier in Mark 10:51, blind Bartimaeus called him Rabboni, which apparently is an Aramaic word, not Hebrew, but it's the Aramaic word, but it was the language of the time, the dialect. Now, dialect is interesting because it's tied into tongues. They spoke a dialect, and not the tongue is a muscle. Speaking in tongues is something that's been invented fairly late because the tongue, the word means tongue, but it also means a wedge shape or tongue-shaped object, or it means language. And so it's a figure of speech anyway. But continuing on our next section, we'll find out all the things that happen now when Paul starts speaking to these people.